I will call the October 7th, 2025 meeting of the Jericho Planning Commission to order. Thank you very much for coming this evening, planning commissioners. Thank you, Chris, as always, for preparing a great meeting for us. And thank you for members of the public who are joining us. Just going to quickly go over the agenda. We pretty much have one big topic to discuss this evening. So we'll have some time for public comment, generally using that time for items not on the agenda, but that is your purview. We will approve the minutes of September 16th. And then Chris is going to lead us through a discussion around dimensional reforms for some of our districts, generally not the village district. And as part of the project that we're in the middle of right now, which is to look at enabling housing in areas of town outside the village center where that kind of development makes sense. Then we'll hear some reports and have other business and plan for our next meeting on October 21st. Would anybody need to make any changes to the agenda? All right. Public comment. So I see that we have a couple people online and Chuck Lace is here with us in the room. Do you have comments? I'll go to the room first. Chuck, please come forward. And try to stay to a few minutes if you can.
So, I opposed this idea of forcing people to live next to the road. You guys did your deep listening. You found out that people want to live closer to the road. And that's now the law. The thing that I want to talk about right now is the enormity of the responsibility that the town has taken on by passing this law. In Richmond, they forced people to live next to the road on a total of 850 feet of road frontage on town road. We have complete control over it. I know we admire Richmond, we admire Waterbury. Waterbury forces people to live and build next to the road on 1,500 square feet between two stoplights. Jericho now, we're requiring it on a total of over 16,000 feet of road frontage. 7,200 feet of road frontage in the corners, 4,500 feet of road frontage in Riverside, and 4,500 road feet in Jericho Center, and for what 12,000 of that is on state road. So I'm sure you've thought through what's necessary in terms of the state road. You sold the idea of forcing people to live next to the road with images like this. Baby carriage, outdoor dining, parking on both sides of the road. I want to live in this picture. I don't live in this picture now. Not even close. There hasn't been a house built as close to the road as you're requiring in Jericho Center for over 50 years. It's not something that people are choosing. And particularly in an area where, 50 years of zoning has directed middle and low income people to this area. And you're saying you want them to live next to the road. So I think the enormity of the challenge for the town now is if you're going to force people to live next to the road, you need to deliver on the image that you use to make the case. So this is like, and over 2,000 feet of this, there's no sidewalk now at all. Most of it is speed limit 35, people going 45. And I don't think you can find towns that have zoned and forcing people to live close to the road under those conditions. I really don't. It's in a fairly large area in Essex Junction, but traffic is slow. Essex Junction also has other opportunities for people besides living, in those areas. So I think it's incumbent upon you to impress upon the select board the obligation that they have taken on, the obligation to create these conditions. Otherwise, you're forcing people to live next to the road in houses that will forever be worth less because they're 30 feet from the front lot line instead of 50 or 60 or 70. People don't want to live right next to the road. They might under these conditions. If you're gonna force people on over 3 miles of road frontage on the busiest roads in Jericho. Jericho Center is the confluence of 3 roads from the north and 3 roads from the south. So it's like this necked-in area. So on the busiest roads in Jericho, most of which are controlled by the state, not by the town, you're forcing people to live next to the road based on this promise. And I think you need to convey to the select board the magnitude of the obligation. And then we have to get to work. There has to be some progress next year. I mean, otherwise, if this doesn't happen, it's just an abuse of regulation. And I think you simply can't ignore that responsibility.
Thank you. Just to clarify, the picture that Chuck is showing is from the original Riverside Planapalooza that happened 15+ years ago, right?
It's in the zoning regulations also.
Yeah, David took that graphic, and that's what that's go to. Okay, any other public comment?
Wayne has his hand up.
Yeah, Wayne?
Yes, thank you. To add to what Chuck is saying, usually how close you can be to the road is a function of the speed limit. So if you drive through places like Seneca Lane in Essex Junction, the speed limit is like 15 miles an hour. And they might even be further from the road from the number that Chuck cited. So I think how close you can be to the road is a function of what speed limits you're setting there.
Okay, thank you. And then did you have another comment, or you're gonna wait on that till we're in the middle of our discussion?
You tell me what would be best.
Yeah, I think. So Wayne wanted to offer, I'm not giving any advice. Wayne wanted to offer public comment specific to the conversations that we're going to have, but we didn't have a public comment time, but we do have a discussion. But do you think, should we just have him offer his comment now or wait? And during discussion, we could listen to what he had to say. He had a couple of maps and things that were very precise. Maybe do it as credit.
Yeah, we can do it later.
Later.
Right before we get
Yep.
to the discussions, probably be fresher in people's minds.
Okay, okay. All right, then Jim, did you have something?
I'm living every single day with the fun of trying to interpret Jericho's regulations. And I think that just taking Chuck's point, I'm not sure that anyone in Jericho has done a study that says anything should be built within a certain distance of a road. A road is a source of air and dust pollution, hazard from vehicles going by that contain and ply the roads with hazardous materials, explosives, gasoline, fuel, and each one of the vehicles themselves oftentimes have all of those combinations, and they're also being driven. So I bought a radar gun. I've clocked the town trucks at 45 miles an hour in 25 and 35 mile an hour zones. I've got triaxes doing almost 50 through Jericho Center. And so if we want to really have a village environment, you got to start with a public works commission and a budget. And I've been living in Jericho for 48 years. There's not a snowball's chance in hell it's in any way safe to have a home anywhere near a road. I've got one of my neighbors at 47 miles an hour on Bulger Hill. Bad sight distances, narrow road, unstable surface, and at 38 miles an hour going around the corner at the bottom of Jericho Center Circle. I've tried for 20 years to get the T intersection designed by the town engineer to truncate Bulger Hill Road to stop the sweep. I personally bought the guardrail, the the Jersey barrier that started closing off the south end of Jericho Center when I was standing with my neighbor on the backside of Jericho Center Circle and a teenager trying to beat his friend who was on Brown's Trace, decided that coming off of Brown's Trace and around Jericho Center, the kids were all playing on tricycles. These are major priorities, and we're spending our time on what will a house look like and where it should be located. I'm working with a group called the Pacific Law Foundation, and we're challenging in multiple jurisdictions where people who think they know better than the people who own the property and who live in the property as to how to paint the pretty picture. I have a graduate degree in economic business. There's not a snowball's chance in hell that the town of Jericho citizens are going to fund a major public works standards to do the traffic calming, to create the pedestrian safety. We fought for years just to get the little tiny bit of sidewalk that we have. And look what happened when we put speed bumps in that slowed people down. It was the wrong design, wrong product. But the thing is, if you want to have high density, as Chuck said, close to a road, traffic lights, barriers, we're not even close to that. So I sit through all these meetings and I listen to all this stuff and I say, what world are we living in? My property taxes were subsidized by the state this year. I own 140 acres. Do you know what my taxes are? And do you think anybody in Jericho is going to vote for an increase in taxes anytime soon? We spent $4.5 million on a garage without potable water. And we want to tear down the functional building that's there and not use it for a function. It's a functioning building right now today. So the economic reality, safety, quiet, clean air, clean water. For the human beings, it seems to me as though we're more concerned about turtles and frogs and wildlife than we are about the people that live here and the people that we would like to live here. Now, I'm trying to build 32 bedrooms right now in Jericho. It's close to impossible. I'll be in court 4 times fairly soon because the regulations are not clear. And it's like, let's get real and let's try to get something significant done. If you want housing, if you want to have a diverse public, if you want to have young people with children, because the system doesn't work. If you don't have kids in the school chairs, you do not get the funding. The algorithm works against the economics. So either we want to get whiter and richer with fewer children and drive anybody else that doesn't fit that formula out, because that's where we're headed. And the money's not coming from Washington and it's not going to come from Montpelier. And I doubt very much that our citizens are going to fund it.
Thank you. Okay, there's nobody else online, right? Okay, so we'll move on to approving the minutes of September 16th. Does anyone want to make a motion to approve the minutes?
I will make a motion to approve the minutes.
And do we have a second?
I'll second.
Eric? Do any clarifications or corrections or edits for the minutes?
Not like typo errors, thing. I think usually we let those go.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, it was,
A couple of them.
it changes the meaning of a thing, but it's just a typo.
Well, it's CSEEs, but SEA kind of does, but I think everybody
Yeah.
knows what you mean by it.
Okay. All right, all those in favor of approving the minutes of September 16th, please say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Extensions? Any no's? Okay. So, trying to restart my engine here.
Before we
Hopefully
do,
I'm
Susan,
steady. Yes.
can I just ask a clarifying question based on the public comment? The new zoning regs, I thought the setback was the minimum, not the maximum setbacks. And so people can be set back further.
In some places where what they're referencing, there's a minimum and a maximum.
Okay, thank you.
That's correct. And based on the feedback that we got, we did increase the maximum
That's what I
setback.
thought.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that my understanding was correct.
Most of the other setbacks, like where we're thinking about tonight, are minimums, not max, and don't have maximums
Okay,
currently.
that's right, because that's when I did my
Yeah,
homework.
okay.
I read it, because you put a lot of work into
Yeah.
putting together our presentation. Thank you.
Oh, well, you'll hear more about that too, so.
Okay, so with that, we can pass it over to Chris Shaheen, Jericho
Great.
Town Planner.
Thank you. So, tonight for this section, I'm just gonna go through what I usually do, sort of our charge and our timeline, and then I'm gonna answer some previous questions that came up. Then review the guidance to date, make sure that that's still on track. Then I've got some background information for today's discussion, and then we'll have a discussion and hopefully come up with a list of some dimensional considerations and potential reforms we can take a look at. And just so you understand sort of how I am mapping all of this out. So I'm going through the guidance that is consensus around each time. So we're building on that. And then when we get to the point where we're going to have a red line to look at, the red line will associate directly with each of those comments. So it's not going to be like, here's a bunch of red lines and they all seem out of the blue. There's going to be a purpose and a rationale behind each of them. So we can consider them in direct correlation to the direction that was given to the Planning Commission when we get to that point. All right, so again, here's the charge from the select board. So today's discussion is going to touch on several of the topics that we were asked to look at. So reducing and eliminating lot sizes is one, reducing and eliminating frontage requirements, and then density calculations. To some extent, the ask was specific to allowing and incentivizing certain types of housing in the context of density. So we are methodically moving through our timeline and we're staying on track. So last meeting it was housing types. This time we're looking at dimensional reforms. And then our next meeting we're going to look at site design and resources, and we'll start to look at the forest blocks, which is the other component of what we're taking a look at as part of this. All right, so one of the questions that came up last time was how much autonomy does Jericho have in updating its zoning? This took a while to figure out. So CCRP was super helpful in figuring this out. So the straight answer is that the zoning is ours to develop and implement, but it's not without any, there are some caveats associated with that. So state statute requires that our zoning be consistent with the town plan. And our town plan has to further state goals that include things like maintaining historic settlement patterns, and then residential development should be concentrated in villages and growth areas. So that's coming from the state, which we have to incorporate into our town plan, and our zoning by state law has to be consistent with our town plan. Now, I said CCRPC doesn't have a role in our zoning, and they don't, not directly. But their approval is related to their approval of our town plan, because zoning has to be consistent with the town plan, right? So there's a process in which CCRPC has to approve and confirm the town plan. So if you remember, I wasn't here, but if you remember, there was some areas that we wanted to push our village area, and I think we had to go back and forth with CCRPC because it wasn't consistent. So we had to, because we really needed their confirmation, we needed to really work with them to get to a point where they could approve our town plan. And with that approval, we get certain benefits. And I'll talk about those in a minute. So their review looks at consistency with state planning goals and compatibility with the regional ECOS plan. And I'm going to say this because I learned this and I want to share this. ECOS stands for Environment, Community, Opportunity, and Sustainability. I don't think anyone else knows that except for those of us in this room. Okay. Okay, so the benefits that we get with that approval, we get to work with them instead of the state, Department of Housing and Community Development. They would be looking specifically at housing requirements in our town plan, but it's not like there's no review. We would have to work with them instead of CCRPC. So that's one benefit we get, is just working with our local regional planning commission. The other is that state agencies, if they're doing something, they have to comply with our town plan. So that's a big thing. So if they're coming in and they want to do something, if we didn't have a confirmed plan from CCRPC, they could just ignore what we thought. Another is, it gives Jericho the authority to levy impact fees on new development. So right now, there are at least two impact fees that we generate some revenue from. Roads and transportation and recreation and open space. I think they were last looked at in 2016. For what I found, they can generate anywhere from 20 to 40,000 annually. So it's not nothing. I mean, it's some money that goes into the town's budget. The biggest one, I think, is that it makes us eligible to receive grant funds for planning. So that's like our municipal planning grants, the UPWP assistance we get from CCRPC. So that's a long answer of saying, yes, we can do what we want with our zoning. It needs to be consistent with our town plan, and no, CCRPC doesn't have a role in reviewing our zoning. Like, yeah. So any questions about that?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So in our town plan that talks about developing our village centers, which would include Riverside, which is on Route 15. So this, when the RPC approves the town plan, presumably somebody at the state level is aware of that. Is there any opportunity for us to influence, for example, the speed limit on Route 15?
I wondered if that's where you were going, because I think that is a great question. And I mean, I have had, not in this context, but I have had other conversations with CCRPC about streetscape standards and getting VDOT to comply with them. And that's just a problem across the state. So I don't have an answer to your
Because I would argue that, I think one could argue successfully that the direction that Jericho wants to go in the Riverside area is different than when Route 15 was established and speed limits were given to that road. And so if the state is approving our town plan with that goal in mind, it would seem they would owe us some opportunity to weigh in on speed limit of Route 15.
Of course, there is precedent for that, because you'll recall after the accident at the bottom of road down here on the corner, the speed limit was changed in Jericho from 35 to 25. And I believe there was a public petition for it and a statement of public safety, which the death was considered indicative of lack of public safety. So it had been 35 from Silly Hill all the way down to
The problem is when it goes from 25 to 35 to 45 to 50, people don't generally make those changes. You know, so anyway, I just wonder if
that's enforcement.
if the state owes us some consideration of that road, given that things have changed.
That's an enforcement issue, not a speed limit issue.
Well, it's both. I think
If you don't enforce the speed limit, it's not a speed limit.
sure, but
But let's have
in
the
my
speed limit
opinion,
first.
when the speed limit, there's 4 different speeds within 3 miles. It makes it much less likely that people are gonna follow that, I think, but anyway.
This is not the town of Jericho assuming and taking over and ownership of Route 15. You're suggesting that might be a different kind of review.
Well, I don't think that's realistic, that the state is gonna give Jericho Route 15, but do think that if we work backwards from this, the way this is structured, then there ought to be some give and take in both directions.
I don't know. I don't know it's right to say that the state would never give it to, it would never.
Yeah.
There was a process.
There's a process.
Yeah.
It happened
I've heard
in
that too.
other-
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's
but,
how we changed the scene, was we went through the process.
but in terms of, Jericho getting control of it, it would allow us to make all types of streetscape improvements.
Right.
We would then be responsible for plowing, and there's a lot of other stuff that goes along with it, so.
I mean, we're putting a lot of effort into developing Riverside into a walkable community. And it's Route 15 racing through there is a big challenge to that.
I think that is definitely something to add to our list of things. Yeah.
I
Any
think
other
it's
questions?
possible to petition V-Trans to get a change made for safety, and like there's a list of criteria that you can use to petition the speed limit on a stretch of road that's controlled by V-Trans. I think they have it posted on their website somewhere.
So maybe that's our next after December 18th conversation.
Yeah, it's like, I think it's a future year work item, if that is something that we want to pursue.
I think it fits with the town plan and what we hear consistently at every town gathering, including the most recent town meeting reimagined. So I think having it, I don't know if it's the other committee that's looking at it, but wherever it fits in what committee in town is the right one.
Doesn't have to be us.
Yes.
It's not really our bailiwick.
So what is on our list of things to do next year is working with CCR, the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission, or CCRPC, to update our bike and pedestrian plan. So that would seem to be a good opportunity to see how we can have that discussion as part of that.
Right.
But it seems like everybody now gets what Chris has laid out for us, which is the somewhat indirect, but very powerful relationship that CCRPC has over our activities here.
Very helpful. Thank you.
And I know we're gonna get to it later, and this sort of just worked out. But at our last meeting, we also reviewed the intent of our zoning districts, which is, I think, really helpful in framing how we are looking at what we are doing. Okay. All right, so another question was a question about this 80% of development has to be in growth areas. Where does that come from? Well, I found out it's actually 90%. It was updated in 2024, and it is included in the ECOS plan. So growth areas account for 15% of the region's land area, including downtowns, village centers, planned growth areas, and village areas. For Jericho, our growth areas are the village centers and village areas. This rationale is based on creating areas for compact walkable neighborhoods with diverse housing and efficient transportation, cost-effective ways to focus resources on infrastructure in certain areas, and reducing reliance on cars. So more opportunities for walking, biking, that type of thing. The ECOS plan specifically identifies municipal planning and zoning as a tool for realizing this goal. So any questions about this? And actually, I think this question came from you.
Yeah, can you clarify one more time our identified growth areas? Is it our village center and village zoning districts? Are we is it constrained by those boundaries, or is there a different definition?
It's not directly, well, it's a little complicated. In the context of where this is coming from and the ECOS plan, it is related to the future land use map, which identifies for Jericho, the village centers and the village area. So on the screen, it's the map that's on the right side. Well, that's what's proposed. Currently, It's the image on the left side, which is just that yellow area. So there are, people have handouts here, and actually I sent you a link to where those were if you wanted to be able to look at those more
I got it.
closely.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so that 90% of growth for Jericho is, according to the Ecos plan, supposed to be happening in our village centers and village areas as they are shown on their future land use map.
On their future land use map. So our designated growth areas are the CCRPC's growth areas. I understand that the areas that the CCRPC have are like tied to, you know, funding and whatnot. They are one and the same for us.
I'm going to ask you to look just narrowly at this slide for now, because my next
Okay.
slide is going to get into where you are going.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so
I
the
will
90%
zip it.
goal is from the Ecos plan, which CCRPC's Ecos plan, and it associates with their future land use map. And the growth areas in their future land use map for us are just our village center and village area. There are other growth areas on their transect, but for like, we don't have a downtown and we don't have some other things. We just have village areas and village centers.
I got it. We're in the world of the confusion between what our zoning district names are and the terminology that they use to designate areas. I'm with you.
Yeah. Yeah,
Keep
so in this
going.
case, just looking at what CCRPC, where their standard is coming from and what it applies to. Okay. I would say, are there any questions on this, but I want to get to the next slide because I think it might answer some of the questions. Okay. So what does this mean for Jericho? So for this, I'm going to refer to the future land use map in our town plan, which shows a little more designated areas as growth areas. And that's the area around the high school. So that is not consistent with the regional map. So if you are looking on the screen, or if you are looking at what you have in your handout,
Yeah, so I will take any.
it is this pink area right here. Right here, right? So that's around, and I should know the names by now, but that is Bounce, Trace, and Packard, right? Okay. Yeah, so.
And Morgan.
And Morgan. So our map identifies village core and village neighborhood as growth areas. So those are the areas that are shown in the red and the pink. And these generally align with our village center commercial and village zoning districts that account for about 13% of Jericho.
Right, so SJ, when you asked your question, what are the growth areas of Jericho? I was thinking what the town plan says, which is, there's a lot of text about it, because I remember working through this with David, but then here, it's what's here on the chart, which are village center, which now has been kind of reallocated, commercial, village, and low density residential.
But the low density residential doesn't correspond to the future land use map.
True, that's where SJ is saying our zoning districts, because the future land use map is not the current land use map, it's the future land use map. It's saying this is directionally where we want to go, kind of regardless of where we are, not regardless, but taking into consideration where we are today.
But a lot of the changes we're talking about are also would take place in low density residential.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think this is where
So the low density residential corresponds with our residential infill area, which calls for things like single-family homes, multi-unit up to 5 units. And clustering on complex lots through tools like PUDs. So in my mind, it's also an area where we can focus our work on housing. But I don't know if that is it or if that's where you're, anyway, go ahead, sorry.
No, it's okay. I think that this is, it feels messy, but I do think it's helpful in getting to the root of the question, which I think for me is when we talk about designated growth areas, what are we talking about? And in my understanding, there's a very clear designation or definition from CCRPC and Montpelier about what designated growth areas means for them and what that means for funding and for approving X, Y, and Z. And then my question is really, I think what we're getting to with looking at the town plan is when we, as Jericho's Planning Commission, independent of that oversight, when we talk about our locations for growth, what are we talking about? And I think that that area wasn't totally clear to me. But what I'm hearing is we're really focusing on the future land use map that's in the town plan. And that includes areas, that includes commercial district, for example, that includes some low density residential, in addition to village and village center. Is that right?
I think yes, because we are allowed, enabled, required, whatever the right word is, by state statute to have our zoning be consistent with our town plan, which CCRPC has approved and confirmed.
Yeah, and I agree. It gets confusing when we're talking about two different things and using the same terminology. And then when we talk about 80% of growth has to happen in this particular area, and the context of which definition we're talking about becomes important. And so I think that's helpful, particularly for this discussion and for this body of work where we've moved out of village centers and beyond village centers to make sure that we are talking about Jericho's planned future growth areas and are become a little less wedded to, I think, the definition or the boundaries that have been dictated by CCRPC, because I think we're informed by that, but I don't think we're bound by that for this discussion and this work. Maybe I'm wrong.
I believe we are bound by what's in our town plan. That's what state statute says.
I guess it's just, it's clearer and less clear at the same time, I guess is how I feel. So to me, intuitively, the map on the right there.
Left or right?
On the right up there.
On the zoning
The
map?
zoning map
Okay.
feels like, which corresponds largely with the map on the left, but from the town plan, feels like a good hierarchy for establishing new growth. But this, not that.
Which one are you showing?
Right, so
I don't, this seems. So I guess I'm.
Yeah.
Unsure of, that there seems to be a little bit of a conflict, right? Because the state statute says we need to follow the town plan, but we also are supposed to be following the CCRPC future land use map, and they don't mesh. So I don't know what we, I guess the clearest I can be is to sort of understand that the hierarchy is village center, village neighborhood, and working out from that. But I think it's important that we, in my mind, anyway, we should also low density residential, because that's that blue section on that makes sense to me where we could develop.
Well, also Chris quantified it, it's 13%. So that means that,
just not looking at topography and wetlands and all the other constraints, just at a broad brush, gets 26%.
which is well beyond the that they're recommending.
So I don't want to make it look like I'm trying to be clever. We clearly have 13% of town that is a legitimate growth area under our zoning. We have another 13% that our town plan and our zoning clearly identifies for housing. And that gets us up to the 26%. It's not a growth area, but it is clearly designated for housing.
So we can grow housing.
Right,
Yes.
and the low density, just for the map challenged. We're looking at, as Chris Brown said, on the right hand, what we currently have as our zoning map.
Mhm.
And we are looking at the blue,
The light blue
the
area.
light blue, which is, we are saying within that light blue area, which is outside of our village centers, commercial, et cetera. We currently have 13%, or we are.
Currently is 13%.
Okay, thank you, that was
Yeah.
the point that I wasn't sure.
Yeah, and actually, the way this is, I see this playing out. This is actually all, although it's messy, I think we're all actually being consistent, because that blue area is targeted specifically for clustering on compact lots through tools like PUDs, that's from the town plan. The direction from the housing committee to the select board was specifically about providing incentives for smaller housing and clustering development. So it's all, at the end, more consistent.
Okay, and if we want to move from where we are now to having more housing and more diverse housing, which is our goal, do we need to stick to the balance of percentages in each of these 4 categories, or can we? Right, those are what they are now, but they're not given, that's what they need to be moving.
I was
Sorry, I'm
looking,
not following.
I was just looking at what
Okay.
does our zoning currently say.
This does not bind us to what it looks like moving forward.
It doesn't bind us, but
Okay,
the state has a goal
right.
and
right.
CCRPC has a goal of targeting growth to 15% of the area. Now that's statewide. Some towns have more, some towns have less. For Jericho, we have 13% designated as growth areas, which is almost at the state goal. And when you add this low density residential area where we can focus on getting more housing, it gets us up to 26%.
Okay,
So I feel like our zoning is, like, our boundaries are okay, like they're in line with what,
okay,
and or even more so, depending on, this is where I don't want to try to look like I'm being clever, because it's really 13%. But we have another 13% clearly designated for housing that we can look at. That gets us up to 26%.
Chris, if I'm looking at this correctly, we've got a very heavy overlap between transition infill and rural general, and then what we have is low density residential proposed. Is that the intent?
And then again,
The overlap between CCRPC's transition infill and rural general and our low density residential, the light blue, is 70%. So they're not necessarily different than what CCRPC, it's just we have a different name for it.
well, I don't think this is what you're asking, but I'm gonna answer it by pointing something else out.
That's fine.
The transition area that they show in orange aligns with the village, the pink village neighborhood area that is extending into our low density residential. That's what I just said.
which map are you looking at?
Sorry. If you
That's
look at
coming
their
off.
map, their future land use map.
Yeah.
There are those orange areas that they identified as transitional, so that's like where we could look, do studies and
Right.
expand our zoning, right? If you look at our future land use map, that's where we have that pink village area designated. that is not consistent with the low density residential, which I think is what you were asking about.
No, because you're pointing to the ones that's between 15 at the last bit of triangle. I'm looking at around the high school on Morgan Road to the. What would
I think
be,
he's talking about this area.
On the zoning map,
Yeah,
Not in the future land use map.
now in the future, our future land use map shows it as village area.
Not low density residential.
Correct,
Because
not
that's
a, not a,
Not as a residential infill.
correct.
Yes,
well, yeah,
But I-
I'm looking at this map. Comparing it with this map.
Yes, okay,
So when I look at the area from Orr Road, there's a nice bright orange, which is transition infill. And it crosses over Brown's Trace onto Morgan Road.
mhm,
And when I look at that same spot on this map,
our current
our
zoning.
current zoning, that is listed as low density residential. I'm just wondering, is there as much, add in also the rural general, which is covering through Lee River Road and through Brown's Trace, all the way through Jericho. They all seem to overlap with the light blue. I wonder, was that intentional? Does that help us at all that we're showing our zoning really does kind of already align with what they have?
yes, so what is shown is intentional, but is there a sub-question to that?
Why don't we just call it what they want us to call it and be done with it?
I would have to posit that I don't really care what it's called. Only because the goal
Is more housing.
is more housing. And so, and let's figure out where we want it and then we'll decide what it's called. So that it meets the standards of the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission's future map and ours. And as long as we are very clear as we have the conversation where we're talking about. Right?
Yeah.
And in this particular location, whether it's considered low density residential on our map or something different in there. We're clear about what it is and then we make the translations afterwards.
Yes, yes, so what we're going through now is
Right.
like, this is just what it is.
Yes.
And we've identified areas where there are inconsistencies,
Yeah.
which I would say are opportunities.
Yes.
And I think those are intentional inconsistencies and intentional opportunities.
So we're gonna step into the opportunities that this inconsistency offers, as opposed to arguing about the fact that we would prefer them to be consistent. We're gonna see it. I'm on board with
right.
that.
In a way, they're supposed to not be consistent because that's the future is leading you towards
Oh, yeah.
change.
I think the part that's hard is in our future land use map and their future, they both have the word future. Right? So that's a little confusing.
Yeah.
Let's just focus on,
Yeah.
let's call it some neighborhoods or areas and say, hey, what do we think about here?
Yeah, I would say that their future and our future are not inconsistent.
Okay, beautiful.
Yeah,
Right.
all right.
Can I just add one more layer to this? Because I bristle a little bit at the CCRPC dictating for us what areas should be X, Y, and Z. This is an iterative process. And to kind of go back to one of Chris's earlier points and thinking about like the hierarchy of the districts. The orange on the CCRPC future. So we're talking about a couple of things. First of all, what the pink on the future land use map means literally for us is like access to funding opportunities or housing related programming from the state and from the CCRPC. And so in my mind, I want to strategize how we can make those pink sections as big as possible and hit the areas where we know in Jericho we actually can support some growth. And that's what those orange areas are. And this is iterative. So CCRPC is then going to come back in 8 years and look at Jericho's zoning and look at Jericho's map and see whether or not it makes sense to turn some of those orange areas pink, meaning that it opens the door for us to get more support. or not turn them pink, and maybe make some more areas orange. And so rather than focusing too much on the hierarchy, I would instead be strategizing about what we want what we want to put in place to make the CCRPC map, a future land use map, the next iteration, look more in line with what our vision for our town is. And I think we did the small working group that gave the future land use, the CCRPC feedback on that, did a lot of work identifying areas that had good soils and good all these things to kind of identify those areas where we really want to push those boundaries for state designated growth areas. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'll stop on this topic, is just because we're talking about these growth areas that we're focusing on, there's also opportunities for growth beyond these areas too, that I think we're talking about with infill and trying to make more housing choices available in more of Jericho. And so, yes, the concentrated effort is in these growth areas, but I think it's important to remember that that's not the only thing that's at least on the table for us to consider.
I like your strategy, SJ, and I'm totally looking forward into deferring for those of you who negotiated very hard on our behalf for the CCRPC map. I know you went to bat.
So I mean, you guys sound very frustrated and you're making huffing and noises and it's very distracting. So I'm sorry that you're frustrated, but we are going to proceed with our conversation. And I would ask you to please not raise your hand because I'm not going to take comments now. We're right in the thick. Chris has an entire logical conversation worked out, but then we'll come back. We're not making any decisions tonight. We have plenty of time. So I would just ask you to please relax and listen, and we're happy to have your feedback, but not right in the middle of the conversation. And I would ask you to please try not to be distracting, because I'm getting distracted, because I don't want you to be upset. Okay, back to you, Chris.
All right. So I think we've cleared up as much as we can on this slide. Okay, great. So there's another question about what does conditional use review mean, other than that it just goes to the DRB for review. So some of this is really basic, like conditional uses are identified on the table of uses, so that's where it tells you if it's a conditional use or not. So the DRB will determine, so the table identifies what uses can be appropriate in a zone district depending on things like intensity of use, site layout, or design. So an example would be like a 5 to 9 unit building in a village district being proposed on a street of single family homes. So that would be an example of a conditional use in the village district. What the DRB would look at would be to make sure that the scale and massing of the design is compatible with the existing homes. They would do an assessment of the additional vehicles, additional parking, driveway access, their impact on surrounding properties, and if there are ways to mitigate it. And then, determine things like screening or buffers to address light, noise, or privacy concerns. So that would be an example of it's a use that we want to see in those areas if it's done in a way that's going to be compatible with existing residents, homes. Like, we don't want to just go in and make everyone unhappy with where they live. So there's a conditional use review to make sure that it mitigates any potential conflicts or things that might be disruptive to the neighborhood. So are there any questions about that? I can't remember who asked the question or where this, I know we were looking at uses last time and whether it should be permitted or conditional. Does this get at what the question was? I'm going to say yes. This is exactly what you wanted to know. Okay.
I'm trying to remember. I feel like it was probably me, and I apologize. And I think that it was probably around, my questions around conditional review are always twofold. One, how much more expensive / of a burden is it on a developer to go for conditional review? And two, how clear, how much leeway does the DRB have in conditional use? And my understanding is that they're pretty narrow and only kind of make decisions based on what's in the regs, but I guess I don't know that for sure. And I think understanding those two questions was really just trying to understand the tension between and striking the right balance in certain districts or whatever between does making this conditional use actually kill the prospect of this? And it's a joke to have the potential for this kind of housing here, either because it's never going to pass or because it's going to be so much of a hurdle that developers aren't going to want to go through the process.
So for the first question about costs, additional costs, I think that's just going to vary depending on what the use is, what the proposal is, and how quickly you can get through the process. If the proposal is pretty much compatible or addresses whatever issues the DRB might raise right off the bat, then that's going to be a quicker review as to one that's more complicated and you've got to go have a couple of meetings and it's just going to draw it out and it's just going to be time. Your cost is going to be time and then whoever you're paying to work through your drawings. For the second question, like what are they looking at? The zoning is very clear on what they can look at and what criteria are that they should be using when they're looking at it. But it's also not a fixed numerical standard. I mean, when you're writing regulations, you want to have some flexibility because some of the review is going to be subjective. Otherwise, you would, if it was just a cut and dry numerical check the box, then there's no reason why it just can't go to the zoning administrator. There is some back and forth and discussion and subjectivity, I guess you'd say, in getting through meeting some of the criteria.
Yeah, I that makes sense. And I think that just kind of what you've provided here is helpful in terms of really understanding what that C means in a use table, so that when we're thinking about moving it or changing it, we kind of understand what that really looks like.
Yeah,
So
if
this
you
is
really
helpful.
want to dig into it, it's section 10.8.3 and 10.8.4 that lists the criteria that they can look at, lists the topics and the criteria that they're supposed to use.
Yeah, and we spent, yeah, no, that was good. And we did spend a lot of time talking about that way back when. So that makes sense.
All right. So that covers all of the questions from the last meeting. So now for a review for where we have agreement on direction. So this is pretty much what we had last time when we reviewed the goals, although we refined the wording in where we are looking to create more flexibility for housing. So that's the underlying wording in that first section, as much flexibility to create housing in more locations. The next one in terms of recapping guidance. So this is also minor adjustments to the guidance, also on location. So we added village centers and commercial districts as areas that should be the focus for housing, and emphasizing a more modest emphasis on rural agriculture, residential, and forestry districts. So what is underlined is what is different. Also under the guidance for uses, specifically recognizing that there are different opportunities for housing depending on the intent of the zoning district. So that came up a couple of times at the last meeting. There was a comment about looking at the purpose of the forestry district to make sure it reflects current thinking. And that was like all that was said. And Wendy, I think that was your comment, and I wasn't sure what the.
I think I have to look at the definition was, but I think it was just a little bit of outdated language.
So the intent was fine. It's just that some of the wording might have.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I'm happy to work with you on that.
Yeah.
And Sabina. Yep. Okay. Is this all? We're still on the same page with this. Great. Great. Good. On the next one. Okay. So usually I do this later. First, I want to get a temperature on the room of what you guys think about getting this additional homework to do and reading it before coming to these meetings. Is it helpful? If it is not helpful, I won't keep doing it.
I find it useful.
Okay,
I think it's great
Sets the tone for what we're
because
doing.
it gives us access to a greater world of thinking about these issues that we wouldn't necessarily have without your
great.
feeding them to us.
Great. I enjoy them. I always like learning new things, and trying to find these also helps me learn new things too. So that's great. So thank you for that feedback. And I also need to thank, well, anyway, so are there any, so so these two articles, had two, just for people listening, the two articles got sent out. One was a keynote speaker at the Vermont Chamber of Commerce's event in Burlington last month. That it was Kevin Chu. He spoke about the need for accommodating growth and being more proactive and addressing, bringing more housing and infrastructure to Vermont. And then there was a editorial in response to that from John, I don't know if I'm going to say his name right, Bassange, challenging what some of the things that Kevin was saying. And he was more of a focus on conservation as opposed to growth. And I think that's a lot of the types of things that we are dealing with here as we're trying to struggle with where we can get new housing. So I don't know if anyone has any burning insights that they want to share, or not even burning, casual insights.
I thought Kevin Chu's was a really interesting and great presentation. I mean, and both with a lot of facts that were interesting and sometimes startling and surprising. And I thought in comparison, the commentary was maybe just in comparison, but it seemed without much fact behind what he was saying. And so I was much more persuaded and interested by Kevin Chu's than in the second one, because I didn't think the second one really refuted anything that Kevin Chu had said. It was just sort of complaining about it.
Anecdotal.
But
It was more anecdotes.
Yeah.
Anecdotal and subjective, you know, like this is gonna be like New Jersey. Well, you know, point of fact, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And even just the idea that smart growth would lower greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, all of those things were sort of, you know, and a lot of the facts about the population trends and economic trends in the state were, it's not necessarily new, but they're striking. The aging demographic, I mean, it's very striking.
I think he presented a very good case for Vermont has underperformed in many ways, Kevin did. And use the phrase, chickens are coming home to roost now. Whereas John was sort of like, no, actually, we like it this way. This is intentional. We don't want to grow. We want to be an older, richer, less populated town. I think he's wrong on that. I think most people living in Vermont would like to see more growth. And I think when Kevin showed the income disparity, the age disparity, the out-migration, it's sort of a call to arms, and we have to do something about it.
Well, in fact,
Quickly.
Kevin had facts that showed that more people now want growth and
Yeah.
new residents and new jobs and
And 60 years ago, that was not the case, 50 years ago.
I thought John really had a pulse on how people feel. Right, the commentary I thought was spot on with what people believe we believe as Vermonters, right? So I think he just channeled it, like the cultural stuff, he just channeled it, he was spot on. And it did make it hard to read in comparison to the factual pieces that were offered. But he did have some very good points that Kevin, right, the presentation didn't have. So one is Kevin did nothing about speaking about where and how development should happen. He just said, we need it and we can afford to grow, whereas the commentary had a little bit more around sort of the ways in which we talk about smart growth and the character issue, right? So there was a little bit more that he offered. So there were pieces there that resonated in terms of the balancing of conservation and the recognition. But he didn't speak to at all, the commentary did not speak to affordability. Like his only arguments for affordability, or his two suggestions of what would make Vermont more affordable or keep us alive, were saying no to out-of-staters. Let's just not let them buy any property, and let's not let them develop, because that's what's pushing up the cost of housing. And we should rely on tourism because that's the biggest bang for our buck right now. Those were his affordability solutions, from what I could tell, and that just seemed like more of the, oh, now we're just gonna, it's an old thing that has gotten us to where we are now, our lack of affordability from my stand. And the commentary said nothing about the fact that we have businesses that can't hire. I thought that the data on the fact that we are currently in a different environment where we have one person applying for every 2 jobs versus 2 people applying for every 1 job, and not having a place for people to live who want to come live here and actually fill those jobs was compelling to me. So, but I appreciate having both, because I do think that they both absolutely, I think you were spot on, Chris, in choosing these, because I think they reflect the difference of ways in which members of our community think about it. And so it's really helpful as we begin our work to carry both pieces in our heads, because we do have a responsibility to our neighbors and the ways that they think and understand, as we try and craft something that will get us where we want to go as per our town plan.
That's where I went, Heidi, with how do we want to craft the message?
Yeah.
Because I would say, like, neither one of those pieces would be how I would want to craft the message, because it felt polarizing.
Yeah.
Right. And what I didn't see, and there was no acknowledging strengths of someone else's positions or perspectives. It's what we typically see now, is not seeking to understand someone else's position. It's seeking to strike it down. And I know that, that was just 2 pieces, but what I took away was like, oh, I don't think I have a messaging around what we're trying to do with that. I would like it to be more in dialogue with folks rather than a debate style.
Yeah. And I think we did that very well in the town plan. I think that we put a lot of work into doing that. We can do that again. So I thought that was helpful.
Yeah.
Very,
Can I
very
throw something into the mix?
Sure.
So at the leadership summit, I went to a session from the Vermont Prosperity Project. And so they're looking at growth through a lens of what they're labeling a well-being economy. So this is a group that is working through a bunch of different resources, Vermont Council on Rural Development, the Gund Institute at UVM, a bunch of different organizations and sort of think tanks are sort of involved with this, but they're talking about their vision as an economy where we meet the needs of all people within the means of a living planet. So I think what they're trying to say is, let's redefine what growth means and just like not grow beyond our resource capabilities. So I just wanted to throw, it's kind of like a good balance between the two articles that we read, because they're, you know, they're working sort of, yes, growth, but how do we grow, you know? So anyway, I thought it was a great presentation at the summit, and when I read the two the two articles, it reminded me that they're out there doing work in the state. So it's called the Vermont Prosperity Project.
Thank you. Were you gonna add something more, Wendy?
No, I was just asking for clarification on the name. Thank you, Stina.
You're welcome.
I like Chris's summary line at the bottom, like, because I think about, there's trade-off, which is like zero sum, you win, I lose, and then there's balance. We've talked about that before. And I think John Bossage was part of what I heard him saying was, or this is what I thought about was there's growth at any cost. And then there's growth at what cost? But instead of thinking about it as, and he's saying, sure, maybe we should grow, but you're kidding yourself to think that there's not going to be a quote unquote cost. But I like the way Chris framed it better, and maybe Wendy a little bit what you're saying about polarizing and debating is like, okay, we're still striking a balance of how we can actually move both of those goals forward instead of saying one has to win and one has to lose. How can we, because if we do a really good job, I think we can improve the situation for both of those things, which seem at odds, but are not necessarily at odds. They're only at odds for people who don't have a good imagination. I think that's a little rude, but they're only at odds if there's a very simple kind of black and white frame. Okay.
Esther, did you want to weigh in?
It made me think of two things. One, I think Kevin's talk, his presentation is similar to a bunch of presentations like that. You know, the data is pretty stark and persuasive, at least of a problem. It did make me think of, and I just am blanking on his name, the housing committee invited, he used to be at VHFA. I think he was once the mayor of Winooski for a little while. He gave a really great talk that was about this, but from a historical perspective that explained a little bit about how we got here. And I think that context is helpful in thinking about what came to mind for me, which is what Heidi brought up, that the kind of the real need to be intentional about affordability and equity, maybe more broadly in general, and that just kind of throwing a lot of housing at the problem or restricting housing and just staying as we are, that will continue to breed inequity. It really is going to take intentional attention, I guess, to those issues while we make decisions about growth. And that I think was lacking, but I think is definitely at the forefront of our minds. And I think I'm glad about that.
That was great. Thank you for all that. All right. So now we're getting to like the main agenda point. Be here after 9 o'clock. I don't know, Wayne, this might be a good time. Wayne, do you want to share what you've got for us tonight?
Sure. Do you have the slides? Can you put them up?
I do not have the slides. If you have them pulled up, we can have it so that you can share your screen.
Let me fit it here. And then, let's see. Zoom. Participants, audio, video, share. Okay. Here we go. Is that show? Oh, share. Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I was on the Affordable Housing Committee for quite a while. And we had talked a lot about how do we get more housing in Jericho? And at that time, we were really focused on the village zoning, which I think is pretty much, you guys have all completed that. But there had been some questions about what was outside of the village. And so we did this study, and so basically the Jericho soils are from glacial deposits. We have 78 different soil types according to UVM, and they're completely different. So you can walk 100 feet and you can be standing on soil that's perfect for building a house and a septic system, and walk over and you're standing on clay or whatever. All these things dropped out of the glacier, got washed around in the lakes, and were deposited, apparently haphazard. So I did a real quick study of the US Department of Agriculture. They have these soil maps and they're based in Colchester. And it looked like 40 to 50% of the soils may not be suitable for in-ground wastewater, where 5.6 were very, very well suited for community wastewater. And so the note here was, if we talk about zoning, we really should not be speaking in a vacuum about density and stuff in outlying districts. Because really you have to look at the soil distributions. And then on top of that, besides the wastewater, you have stormwater runoff and all those kind of things like that. So here you see that I have the yellow circles where Jericho Corners and Riverside are. And so when you think about it, the people that came here.
Wayne,
surveyed-
could you zoom in on the slide a little bit?
Oh, okay.
Or maybe
I'm
just
sorry
go
to interrupt you, Wayne.
No problem. Let's see if-
Yeah, if you go up to slideshow on the top.
Much better, thank you.
That works.
There we go. Yeah. So, so the people that came here, and there were people that came in the 1750s or 60s and surveyed Vermont, because at that time we were called the New Hampshire Grants. And so these people were experts on siting towns. They could walk through a trackless forest and look at trees and dig a few holes in the ground and tell what kind of soil there was, because you had to site houses where you could have a dry basement, because that was your refrigerator back in the day. You had to be able to site an outhouse, and you had to be able to site a well. And so when you think of Jericho and our development, it's the same thing. 200 and some odd years later, you have to site a well and an outhouse in a sense. But if you look at the boundaries proximate of our towns, you see these things encircle a huge area of prime soils, which is what you would want for your, if you're making community septic. So, and then you can see here some of these. This is, you can see Ore Road here. Okay, now again, the blue is the prime, absolute prime soils, the dream soils if you want development. And you see there's some patches here and there. There's tends to be a really big patch right about where guess what? The high school was sited, because back in the day, the people knew, were closer to the land in the 60s or whatever, and could look at the trees and the soil and go, hey, that's where you want a high school with this big, huge septic system. And then if you look here, these are all the other areas now where it's green, there's different degrees. You might have to make a mound system or something. But as you get up into the areas here, so think about it, people will say, I think that I've heard like, well, 70% of the Jericho town isn't developed. But the problem is you have to look at a top map. If you go back to the map you all were looking at, there are like all sorts of topography and steep slopes. Here, across the street from me, I think it's called Huckleberry Ridge. It rises up about 700 or 800 feet, very steep slopes and very unstable. So these are the ones that you would have to spend a lot of money, or they're just completely undevelopable. So the point that I'm making here is that we have this very nice group. I got this from geodatavermont.gov, but there's a USDA in Colchester, and these guys are all soil scientists. And I think if we want to talk about, I don't think we should be talking about, increasing density in rural or whatever, rural resident or low density in a vacuum. I think what we really need is to get these guys to help us and give us a map of these areas, because there's this enormous diversity of soil types. And if somebody says, well, I want to put a cottage court with 10 houses on this place here, you might have, leach from a leach field bubbling up in the next little stream there. So I just think if we talk about density, we really need to be informed about this. I mean, people are talking about wastewater around the Underhill here, and you see there's a lot of places where such a thing could be put in there. Oops, not there, sorry. Here, see there's a lot of areas around Underhill where it could be put in. So my request to the Planning Commission would be to somehow contact with the USDA folks in Colchester and ask them if they can give us a map. I'd be willing to volunteer to contact. I've talked to them a couple times on this stuff. So if you're shorthanded, I could talk to them. They're soil scientists. I'm a scientist, so maybe we can hobnob and cavort and consort, and maybe I can talk them into giving us a map. So I'll offer that. But anyways, my main ask is that the Planning Commission work with the folks at the USDA and get an idea of where our soil types are before we talk about how many houses could you put in the low density area. That's my ask.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Chris.
All right.
So some of the future land use map work that the subgroup did, we did look at soil maps, not as terrific as what Wayne has accessed, I don't think, or the maps that they were using were probably older and less precise. But that was one of the factors that drove the tan areas in the more rural areas and what drove some of the green areas to go dark green or to stay green. Wasn't the only factor, but it was.
And actually, as Wayne was talking, it reminded me that when DCRPC was putting together their future land use map, they were looking at things like topography and natural resource things that influence some of what they have.
So it's a good reminder that when we look at our map, and actually when you look at the town plan future land use map, a lot of it is driven by topography. It's not a 2-dimensional place, it's a 3-dimensional place. Okay.
All right. So before we talk about lot size, frontage, and density, I just want to go over here we go. What each of these things mean when you get into zoning and development. So I'll talk about lot size first. So in Jericho, lot size is associated with density, and that's because the allowable number of units is associated with minimum lot size. From a practical matter, lot sizes relate or can relate directly to infrastructure. So areas with access to municipal water, and hopefully someday septic, can be smaller since those services are going to be off-site, while lots in more rural areas just by necessity need to be larger to accommodate septic fields and well for water supply. Larger lots are also associated with protecting natural resources or protecting areas designated for agriculture from suburban development. Lot sizes are used to realize development patterns that respond to goals in the town plan. So small lots where we want compact and walkable neighborhoods, and larger lots where we want to limit sprawl and maintain a rural landscape. There's also an association with affordability. With small lots, you can get more housing in a given area, which should drive down cost, while larger lots are going to increase housing costs. And then lot size, this is the big takeaway. It's really the most powerful tool we have in managing growth, resource protection, and minimizing costs associated with infrastructure. So concentrating growth where we want to concentrate roads and utilities and things like that. The next is frontage. So the frontage is the area of a lot along a public or private road. So small frontages would be between 50 and 100 feet in length. They create more compact blocks, closer buildings, create more of a pedestrian scale. They're what you would find in our village centers. So where we have lots that are between 50 and 100 feet are like Old Pump Road, Hill Street, and there's some sections of Route 15 and Jericho Corners and Riverside that have that type of frontage. Moderate frontages are between 100 and 200 feet. They allow space for setbacks, wells, septic systems. An example of this is a subdivision that includes Griswold Street, Ross Lane, and Snowflake Drive. Their frontages range anywhere from 155 to 200 feet. So if you're familiar with that area, that's kind of what we're talking about. Large frontages are typically in the 200 to 500 foot range. These are going to maintain appearances of rural countryside and minimize the number of curb cuts on a rural road. The larger frontages, which are the largest, they're over 500 feet. They're typically found in our conservation areas. The requirements serve some of the same purposes as lot size, and they reinforce the desired building pattern. And you just need to make sure that they're appropriate with the intent of the zone district and then the goals that are in the town plan. The third is density, and this is or the number of housing units or people located within a given area. I'm not going to read through this, but this is more than just how much housing we can fit on a lot. It's also related to allowing different types of housing in different areas. It's associated with where municipalities focus their resources on infrastructure like municipal water and sewer, and it has implications for transportation, like where we want sidewalks. Like think about our BMG, where we concentrated where we wanted to require sidewalks and where we didn't. Bike lanes for planning for mass transit, where we someday would have a bus line with stops like that. I included this general overview of our zoning districts just as a reminder of what the purpose of our districts are. So for our discussion tonight, I have focused most of my research on lot sizes, frontages, and densities in our low density rural ag, residential, and forestry districts. These are outside of our growth areas, and the town plan and zoning call out housing for these areas differently. So in the low density residential area, this is intended to be used for housing. It encourages cluster development and the transition from rural to village, some of those you've already talked about. Rural ag and residential, it allows for quote rural housing, it's not defined, and protecting farmland and forestry uses, whereas forestry is our most protective of rural areas and protecting natural resources. The description doesn't even say anything about housing in it. So just a reminder that the intent of these areas need to be considered as we're working through this and trying to figure out how to encourage housing in the best way that we can that's consistent with these districts.
I still kind of do like a twitch when I read the definition of commercial. I really do.
You're not alone.
I'm glad to say it.
That is something that I know we need to look at some point. Yeah.
Does it preclude us from saying you could have housing?
No.
No, and it does allow housing now, and it's one of our zones that allows the most dense housing.
Okay.
I think it's one of the zones that allows the 10+ units.
Okay.
It does not allow single family as a permitted use. Single family is conditional.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So this slide shows our current dimensional requirements for our zones. So I have to say, like after planning for this meeting and reviewing zoning and other nearby towns, and we're going to get into that. I think what we have for our base zoning is appropriate as base zoning. My recommendation is, and we'll talk through this, but my recommendation is that we maintain these and then focus on flexibility to these base requirements as a way to provide incentives for the types of housing that we want to see outside our growth areas. So housing that's smaller, more affordable, and clustered kind of vitamin space. Because you'll see, and I'll go through this, our baseline densities are pretty much in line with comparable zones in surrounding towns. So I'll just kind of go through these. So this slide compares Jericho zoning in our low density, well, the next three slides compare zoning in low density residential, rural ag, residential, and forestry. This is our low density. What I think is most helpful to understand here is what's going on the column on the far right, because this measures residential density. So this is added, wasn't in what got sent out on Friday. And the towns here are listed in order of density on the slides, going from lowest to highest.
I just ask a question.
Yep.
Heinsberg, for example, has a minimum lot size of a half acre. I don't understand how the density relates to that.
I don't.
Duplex per 3 acres, what does that mean?
Oh. So here's what I found out. It's challenging to compare zones from across towns, because you have to go in and you have to look at the purpose of each district, and every town has come up with their own way of regulating things. So it's not like you could just find something that's consistent. There's no consistent measure. So I'm putting different pieces of information in here that measure things differently. I think that's why I think it's the units per acre, the density is the most important, because that's really what well, that's what's driving how much housing you can put where you want to put it. Heinsberg and Westford both have minimum lot sizes of 0.5, and yet per density, you can only have 2 units per 3 acres or 2 units per 5 acres. So I've emailed Heinsberg. Actually, I emailed Alex Weinhagen, who used to work in Heinsberg, to talk through so he can explain, because I've read through their zoning regs and I don't understand how this works. I think it's along the lines of, if you have a property, you can create lots that are small, but your overall density on the project itself is not exceeding something. So you may have a smaller lot, but you have to put some sort of a protective easement or something over the rest of the lot. So overall, your density is still the same.
That could be common land on subdivision.
Something like that.
Makes sense.
Right, so they separate the concepts.
Yes, Heinsberg has separated density from lot size. So when you look at their different zones, there's a table that says lot density, or density for this zone is 0.33 units per acre or 0.7 units per acre.
I can see how that would work if someone was doing a development, but if Johnny has, a 1 acre lot and he wants to sell half of it because half acre zoning, if the greater neighborhood is built up, couldn't do it.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Yeah, and I don't know how, because I know we have people in Jericho that have 100 acres and they just want to carve out 3 acres for a daughter or a child. And I want to look at, there's a place in Iowa that has a way of doing this that I want to look at to see how they have done it, to see if it's something that we can do here. Yeah. So anyway. My takeaway from this was that our low density residential zone is very comparable to what's happening in other low density residential zones. Although we actually are on the high end of units per acre, and this relates directly to the work that we did earlier this year, where we increased the density to fourplexes for the minimum lot size. This slide compares Jericho's requirements for the rural ag residential district to similar districts in adjacent towns. The numbers for the minimum acres and density here are hard to follow because they seem to be all over the place. But again, look at the column on the right. Jericho's, the 0.2 units per acre is pretty consistent. Heinsberg is again interesting because they associate a density per lot based on access to roads. And I know that was something that our working group looked at when we were looking at the flu map, in terms of figuring out what areas would be better for development, like if you were on a paved road versus a dirt road. So I think Heinsberg has something similar to that. I didn't mention, well, no, yeah. So the third one was forestry districts. Again, our numbers here are pretty much in line with comparable districts, with our residential density being on the high end. Several towns had conservation districts that were much more like they didn't allow housing. They allowed seasonal homes, 25 acre minimum lot size. I didn't include those because they just weren't really comparable to what we have here. So this was a lot of detailed information. It really was challenging pulling it together. So I don't know if there are any general questions about what it is. I mean, my takeaway was that we seem to be in line with what our baseline seems to be appropriate and comparable to what other towns around us are doing.
Well, our dimensions are comparable and our density tends to already be on the higher side.
Yes.
But this is, I mean, I think this is great, very interesting information to have. So I thank you for doing it. This is all, what would be interesting to know is how the regulations relate to built structures. Because like some of the regulations that are relatively new, like the built structures don't exist yet, right? They haven't. So I guess my it's not really a question, but it would be interesting to know how the regulations compare to reality, and it might take 5 years to know about how they, how it's working.
Yeah, and these are also just like dimensional requirements.
Yeah, right.
Each town has their own set of standards that they use. Like Westford has a whole form-based code that applies to much of the town, which has minimum and maximum setbacks in some areas. So like I said, it was hard to compare these. And the charge that we got was specifically looking just at some dimensional things. And that was what I pulled together. That kind of gets us to where we're gonna have a discussion. And as I was writing these, I went back and looked at the charge again, which was to look at dimensional requirements. And the recommendation was for reducing or eliminating lot sizes and frontages. And it emphasized looking at the village centers and the village districts. It looked at updating density calculations to allow and incentivize for small dwellings, dense housing options, and more types of housing, and to permit and incentivize clusters of small dwellings and PUDs. So given these directions, I think like the order of these questions and the 3 questions are a good way to discuss this. So do our current dimensional requirements generally support the purpose of our zoning districts, or are there small adjustments that could bring them into better alignment? Within the intent of each district, or dimensional standards make it easier or harder to create the diversity of housing our community needs? And then given our time constraints, because we want to have something in January, what are some simpler, straightforward flexibility that we could consider to encourage more housing options while still maintaining the intent of the zoning district? These are all like complex questions. So I don't know if we just want to get into discussion, if there are questions.
Do you feel like we could be using density as a tool more than we are relative to lot size? But we don't really use it in the same way that Heinsberg does. Doesn't seem that we do. Yeah, well, I'm just wondering if in the village district, from my thought for a while has been, should we go from 1 acre to half acre? But now I'm wondering if another way to think about that is to think about the density as opposed to the lot size.
My thinking, and it changes, it's not always, it evolves. Because a lot of what the charge was looking at, how to incentivize the type of housing that we want to do. So it seems like we've got two types of areas. There's like the village and the commercial area, and maybe the low density area where we want to encourage things like cottage courts and smaller housing. And so maybe there's a density incentive that gets at that type of housing that we want. And then there's another type of an incentive for, and this may also apply to low density residential and the rural ag. I'm not sure about forestry yet, in my mind, that also provides a density bonus, but there are different guidelines that get at clustering and preserving this space. So instead of looking at our base zoning, looking at I'm not sure how to, incentives to get at the type of housing we want, that is two types of housing for two different areas. And how that's laid out, I need to work with Chris Blaine on how that would work out.
And can I just make sure I'm understanding what you're saying? Because once upon a time, I finally got the I grab onto like the big baseline pieces to help me sort through the details. And what I understood is there's a baseline piece that I think you just said, which is what do we achieve through the regulations and what do we achieve through incentives? And regulations are the zoning and incentives are part of the zoning, and or are they more of a policy thing? That's the part where I keep getting lost.
Yeah.
So like when
Yeah.
you say an incentive, is it still within the zoning or is it a?
It's still in the
different
zoning, and we actually have some of this in the zoning already. So like our PUDs will say, if you do smaller houses or senior housing, you get X amount of more density. You can ask for X amount of more density.
And so that's something that we conceivably could put on another proposal of that in these conversations that we're talking about.
Yes, so maybe
Okay.
there is a section of zoning that is specifically targeted at encouraging housing that could apply anywhere if you meet certain criteria. And I don't know what those criteria are, but we have some, like maybe it's lots that are like in Heinsberg, you get a bonus, you get more density if you're off of a paved road versus a dirt road. You get more density if you have access to water versus on a well. There are things that we can look at that make it both easier
Soil.
to build soil. Yes, soil.
Right.
That make it easier to build housing. And we could say if you build houses that are 1,500 square feet. So if you remember some of the research that we did in talking to Champlain Housing, like some of the cottage court stuff we read said like 1,200 square feet was what their cap was. And then talking to Champlain Housing, they were like that extra 300 feet that gets you up to 1,500 square feet really makes a big difference in making some of these small houses really livable. So maybe there's an incentive that if you've got X percentage of housing that's 1,500 square feet, that's going to conceivably make them more affordable, can get more density, more compact development. We could bake that into a regulation. And if you're doing that, that's gets you more density.
Okay, and so that then translates to you're saying what we have now is the base is a good base. But we want to potentially add on these little, like it's like the tree that you add little trinkets to. Is that it?
I'm
You're
not following
positing.
I'm not following the tree ornament analogy.
Certain things,
Right?
if you,
Yes.
then you get to add on.
Right,
You get a
but,
better.
but here's the base, we're not changing the base, but we can make it
Yes.
shinier over here or more beautiful over there with whatever. It's a terrible analogy. Somebody help me out.
I got you.
Yeah.
But, okay,
It's the incentives that you're talking about.
right, but no, it's what I'm, because I was trying to make sense of when you said the base feels good. I think I understand what you're saying, translating out loud, the base of what we have in terms of the size, the number of acres and the number of lots per acre, and then the density within that all feels right sized right now, given the changes we've already made, with a little bit of tinkering perhaps.
Yes,
Where we can get creative is the incentives.
I think there are some things worth looking, like, I think it's worth looking at what Heinsberg, like, what they have going on, what Westford has going on. To see how there are parts of that we can incorporate that could help us get at,
Okay.
because what that's doing for them is getting them toward that clustering.
Yeah.
I think when I looked at some of the Heinsberg and the Westford that you were showing just there, it struck me that, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I've got, say, 75 acres, and the density on that 75-acre lot is one house for every 5 acres, I should be able to cluster develop like 30 acres in there. So I've got a nice tight area in the one part of my 75 acres that's got soil, water, everything that's right, and the rest of it stays common land. And that's, I presume that's something that Heinsberg wants. And it strikes me that if we want to increase housing in more parts of the town without sprawl, that's one of the solutions we can use.
Yes.
I'm feeling unsure about if some of the base is appropriate base. And we're talking a lot about, or some of the examples that we're using are around PUDs and with the assumption that a developer's coming in and wants to build. And I'm thinking about, one person who wants to build their house on a lot. And it's really expensive to buy a 3-acre lot versus a half-acre lot. And I don't think I am at the point where I think that some of our base zoning is appropriate to achieve the more housing types in more areas. I think I need to sit with it more. And actually, I'm curious about what you're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we worked on the density, we all said, we need to come back to this and talk about this more, particularly in rural ag. So we made some changes, which, were good, 4 units per minimum lot area in low density residential, village and commercial, but we wanted to have a deeper discussion than we had time for. And so I similarly on density, but on all of these other things too, I feel like I don't know that I'm certainly not at a place to be like, yeah, what we've got now is great. Like I fundamentally disagree with that, I guess, but I definitely want to have more conversation about it. And I'm having a hard time focusing to make any kind of coherent argument about anything here. I think in general, yes, we've been moving in the right direction, and yes, there needs to be more. And we specifically set this time aside and this project aside to talk about these issues outside of the village center. So let's talk about it. But I don't know how to answer the questions I don't know how to engage in the conversation. Sorry, none of that's helpful.
It is.
I don't know if this is what you're getting at, Wendy, but as I have been working on this, there's sort of 2 scales.
Mm-hmm.
There's, like you're saying, the PUD or the developer that's coming in and is subdividing and doing a lot. And that, I think, is what this is what we've been talking about is sort of geared around. Then there's the other one of, I just want to create a 1, 2, 3 acre lot for a family member. And that is not being captured here. And that is something that I need to look at more because I think we need to, I would like to be able to address that.
It seems to me that if, all that information you pulled together from all these surrounding towns that shows that our current zoning is kind of right in there with everybody else.
Or a little better.
Or a little better, doesn't address the fact that there's still a housing crisis.
That it's failing.
So,
Yeah.
so that goes back to my question of the difference between the regulations and reality. And it makes me wonder, I guess, what you found, all that great information is what the other towns have now, but what are they working on behind the scenes to improve?
Well, some of those towns on that list, we see, you can drive around and see a lot of growth, right? Like Shelburne was one of the towns on the list, and Shelburne has the largest project going live like any minute now. So it accommodates that kind of growth in the areas where they want it. Same thing, Heinsberg Village Center, they've gotten closer to the picture that Chuck was showing at the beginning with their village green. Sure, it's taken 10 years, but they've spent a lot of money. Now they have a new senior housing project there also. So those towns are growing more than Jericho is growing. Those towns are growing primarily in their growth areas. And
Where they have infrastructure.
where they've invested in infrastructure because they had a plan that that's where they want it. You know, we're behind. We're kind of playing catch up here. But I think that's why when I listen to Chris saying, you know, we're kind of on par, and he's saying it's hard to vote across the board, but they are succeeding in directing a lot of their growth to the areas where they want to grow. They're not on par, and maybe it's not enough, because yes, it is a housing crisis. Maybe it's not enough land, maybe it's not fast enough, but that's what their zoning is and infrastructure investment is producing.
That sort of raises a question that I don't know the answer to. But Heinsberg, Richmond, Shelburne, Huntington, all have a single village center where all the services are clustered. We don't. How much does that concentration of the single village center drive more growth? Because you can make the investments of water and sewer in that village center.
Right, so
Yeah.
Jericho, I mean, you know, if you did it by the numbers, you would say these other village centers are nice, but we're gonna double down on one. Because we can't afford to do it all everywhere. It's gonna take too long. It'll take 50 years. We'll be dead by then. You know, one could make that choice. We, the planning commission, expressed that priority in the town plan for sure. And said to the select board and to the town, this is where the greatest opportunity is.
I mean, the other thing that I did when I was doing this, because it was frustrating because I'm like, well, how much of the town, of these towns is this zone district? I mean, am I not comparing apples to apples, right? So then I pulled up the zoning maps just to make sure. And like, what I'm looking at for our low density zone, of the low density residential zone, like all the comparable zones are that bubble of zone around their village centers where you get out to their rural ag or their forestry zones. And then once you get past that, it's like this is Heinsberg. And everything that's green is their ag and everything, or well, maybe brown is their ag and green is their forestry. I mean, it's like big parts of the town. It's similar to how Jericho is set up. I mean, it was really enlightening looking at how, as much divergence there was a lot of similarity in how their zoning was set up.
But still, even in Heinsberg, it's concentric circles out at the center. yes, on the opposite sides, one's forestry, one's farmer. But we've got concentric circles coming from three centers. With
Yes.
some overlap, that's, you know, when we look at it, that's sort of that whole area, Browns Trace, Lee River Road, that's like, should be the center, maybe not, I don't know, but.
Conceptually, we have set ours up where you have sort of like a megalopolis in the middle that is connecting our three village centers, and that's where we're putting all of our growth, and we're putting the lower densities on the outside, which is, it's like as consistent as we could be with those growth patterns in the other towns. That makes sense.
If we take that, then shouldn't we throw all of our higher density into that area? The triangle between Browns Trace, Lee River Road and Route 15. And that should be what we're saying is there. But we're not. We haven't said that. We said Riverside, which is in this upper corner of the town.
Well, it has the biggest development opportunity. Where we can put our.
Say I'm starting to fade, and so like if we could zoom back out per se. And just remember, when there were certain, and I know it's gonna make everyone crazy, because you wanna be in the details, I wanna be in the zoomed out. Once upon a time, when we first started looking at this, and I think that last meeting, and I think Chris Brown and I were kind of both in the same place of like, man, like somebody, how many ever years ago drew these districts and decided we needed these ones, and should we blow up even perhaps the whole idea of having the 3-acre, 10-acre forest, right? And then we got more information tonight that tells us, thank you, Wayne, that like, oh, there was some sensibility around soils. If you actually, whether it was prescient or science-based, there's something about how we've developed over time that actually fits with some of the soils. Should you use that as one of the primary organizers, or just as we have said, we're gonna make decisions based on protecting natural resources. When we look at this question, should we also add in, oh, and now we're gonna say, we're going to incentivize within these zones, places for development that have good soils. So we're gonna keep 10 acres. We're gonna keep 3 acres, but we're also gonna say within those districts, or what do we call them, zoning?
Districts.
Right? We're going to incentivize denser or a certain type of housing, because the soils can manage it. And we think it's important that we have more housing and more diverse opportunities in those, in addition to the good work we've already done in the areas that we've already touched. But we haven't, so, I mean, that would be one option I'd like to put on the table for conversation. And then the second one, going back, SJ, I think, you were saying that, we had said we were gonna delay certain conversations. I wanna make sure that we've had the full conversation about, again, going back and tracking our own conversations and decision-making. Have we done thoroughly what we intended to for the Golden Triangle? So that we have created the opportunities and incentives to have as much development as possible in that Golden Triangle. Right? So have we already done that? Because that's something we said we wanted to do. Right? And then we also said we wanted to look at what is now low density residential, so that next bump out, not going all the way out, but just that next bump out.
Yeah, I think I would, again, to answer her question, you can tell me if I'm wrong, in terms, like, have we done everything in the Golden Triangle? No.
Okay.
Which is exactly the opportunity that we have, because the space of the current zoning map, as it is laid out, the triangle is filled in. First of all, there's all kinds of hills and mountains in the middle of the triangle, and there's rivers going around. Like, that's why the settlement pattern is partly the way that it is. But in any event, the zoning map says that that's sort of, he showed us brown and green in Heinsberg. We're blue and light blue.
Yeah.
And that is village and low density residential. which says to me, that's kind of like not low hanging fruit exactly, but kind of like low hanging fruit, like, let's, you can't, like, we can't spend all the money on all the village centers, we can't necessarily, it's like, let's double down potentially on really incentivizing, and not just incentivizing, but maybe also removing barriers.
Right.
In those areas, and I would include the commercial district in that because it's in the triangle. And the map already does that for us. So I feel comfortable with the map, the
Yeah.
way that it is. But I think, and the question here is not about density. The question here is about dimensional requirements. So yes, they're related, they're not the same. And so what I think Chris is saying, when he's saying the baseline, he's saying the dimensional, which is pattern and physical, and density is development, money, intensity, people, land use that layers sort of on top. What I sort of heard him say is like the way the pattern is okay, but we could do a lot better with density, but not just broad brush, because it's not really, it's not the housing that we want. Doesn't matter. It's the housing that we need. And so we want to use all the tools to reduce barriers and incentivize the housing that we need, not just $400,000 or even $700,000 houses. Like, if all we do is change the dimensional requirements, that's all we'll get. Right. We'll just get more big houses, which is fine. Supply is a big part of the problem, but it's not like somebody was saying, we have to be intentional.
Yeah.
Like, so that's what I hear you saying. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's getting at the intentionality of getting over, because right now, I don't think zoning isn't what's holding up development.
Right.
There are 100 other factors that are holding up development. But we want development. We know we want it in these areas where it's not entirely consistent with the intent of the zone, but there's a way that it could be. And thinking through what are the qualities that would make it consistent, and packaging those criteria with density.
Yeah. So I
I-
would love, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jane.
I just want to bring us back to, or I just want to put a pin in it and not dig too deep because it's 9:04. But one of the things that came up in conversation at the last meeting, I think Heidi, we were talking about uses, and then we stopped the conversation about uses because we needed to talk about dimensional standards in order to address uses, and we kind of got into a cyclic thing. One of the things that I'm interested in is how some of these standards impact multifamily housing. And did you, Chris, happen to see? I remember digging through. I commend you because I remember digging through all of these regs for the density work that we did, and everybody's got different names for their districts, and they calculate things different. I mean, it really is. Summarizing on this level is kind of helpful, but I think a lot of the fruit that we can learn from is in some of these details. So an example detail would be in Richmond, they have a multifamily housing development standards section that's separate for their multifamily housing. I don't remember what it looked like. I do remember that Richmond at some point was having a push to try and increase multifamily housing in a couple of their districts. And so I wonder what that section looks like, what we can learn from that. And so some of these like caveat areas may help us think more about just what you're talking about, how to use these dimensional standards and stuff to encourage the kind of housing that we need. And then also, are there some specialty cases where we can say, okay, if you're building 1,500 square feet, or if you're building a multifamily housing unit and no unit has more than 3 bedrooms, then you can have X, Y, and Z. And so like that, I think is just going to require some more digging and some more in-depth conversation.
I didn't see anything that got into the level of specificity, like number of bedrooms and things like that. I did find examples, at least one example of where there was like a rural district that allowed, I don't know, it may have been like a 5-unit or a 6-unit building, but the density requirements didn't change. So you may have been able to do a duplex on
Well,
10
and this
acres.
is, I mean, this is what we talked about when we did density two, right? So
Yeah.
if we,
You could do a duplex on 10 acres, but then you could do an apartment, or you could do a multi-unit buildings with 6 units on 30 acres. So the density was staying the same.
exactly, and so the conversation, you know, about uses and do we want to permit a fourplex in rural ag? Well, then that we would have to change, would we have to change density? We would have to change density in order to be able to do that unless people had to, you know, have twice the
wouldn't
amount of land in order to put a fourplex
Yeah.
out there.
You wouldn't have density, and like that's what I think that's what Heinsberg has done. Like they didn't change the density. You can build more diverse housing, but the density doesn't change.
Yeah.
And in a way, that makes the property potentially more attractive. Because now you're on a quad on 10 acres as opposed to being on a quad on 1.5 acres. So from the residential aspects of it, you're getting more property or access to more property for basically the same price. Or potentially the same price.
That would be a way to market it, yeah.
Okay, so it is 9:00 whatever, and I
Do
feel like
we-
we should somehow come to not conclusion exactly, but
Well, my conclusion is that there probably needs to be a working group that digs into this a little bit more. With some thoughts.
between
Good.
now and the
Comment?
next meeting. Yes, but I just want to get an action here first.
Yeah, which is which is October 21st. Well, I think we should meet before October 21st and see what we can figure out and then see how long it take us for us to come back.
Okay.
I'd be happy to be on that working group.
Okay.
Can I make an amendment?
Ditto.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that is, because I wanted to just jump to number 3. Here, the third one, which is, what simple, straightforward flexibility should we consider, or just the idea of time constraints? Given that we have time constraints, I wonder if, just as we did, which makes people crazy, a stepwise approach to taking on different sections instead of thinking we're looking at everything. At this moment, do we finish up the work on the triangle? Finish up the work on the low density residential, right? Like just think about stepwise. Because we will circle and we will get too big. And my worry is that we'll circle, will get too big, and I'd rather see us get something.
Yeah.
So, just a thought for, and again, it's an offer as opposed to a request.
yeah. Okay, did you have anything else you want to say on this
Well,
topic?
The only thing I was gonna say was, I mean, there is so much we could do, and I think what you can see that I'm trying to do here is like to
Yeah, exactly.
narrow it so that we can
That's
get
why I
something.
was, yeah.
done by January, and I don't know how satisfying it's gonna be. I think we'll be able to do something that addresses what we've been asked to look at, but it's not gonna be a big wholesale transformation of how we do zoning.
You have been very patient. Thank you very much. I'll give you a couple minutes each if you would just be mindful of the time, knowing that we can talk offline anytime.
I'm gonna try to use your acronyms. I think you are close to a point of significant change, and I'm gonna call it a SWAT team. Special Weapons and Tactics to solve the current problem, which is the economic destruction and the diversity and the housing potential for Jericho. Forget what everybody else is doing. Our topography, our circumstances are all different. So if we look at this resource-based planning, that's what Wayne did. He showed you, ignore all this dimensional stuff. You want to keep going on that, that's fine. But let's SWAT it. Because the way you develop land in Jericho is based upon its resource itself. So go to the PUD, pragmatic fact-based design, PFBD, resource-based planning, RBP, resource living design, RLD, safe, quiet, clean, SQC, environmental, efficient, and integrated, EEI. We can do all of those things. If you want to come over and see what we're doing with millions of dollars invested in Jericho, directly behind the high school and right in front of the firing range, we've got 24 bedrooms with six garages and stuff all built. And we can't get through your planning process because we had an application to amend.
We can't talk about.
Okay, I understand. All I'm saying is that there are practical solutions that can be implemented. Going through a conventional meets and bounds, frontage, side yards, all that other stuff, I don't think is the right way to do it. And I can give you millions of examples. But if you just say, gonna keep this project going the way it's going, but we'd like to get something done. Those of us who actually use a shovel, a rake, and can drive a bulldozer and a dump truck, we can show you how to get something significant done and get it done fast. And there's financing and legal. These things are very complicated. And looking to Montpelier or to regional planning, I sat here and listened to regional planning, and he's taking one of the prime opportunities for recreational use and development in Jericho that's in effect almost in the public sector, the Rivers' property, and highly restricting. So there's great opportunity, but not continuing to go the same way that you're going. The
Okay.
definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing in the same way and expecting a different result.
All right, Chuck.
I would encourage you to think of density in terms of bedrooms and not units. You know, I think one of the, through time and including in Jericho, basically towns meet their environmental and agricultural objectives by moving around low and middle income people and letting rich people do whatever they want. So we have 4 luxury developments under construction right now in Jericho. One of them is in the Forest District, 45 bedrooms, where it's illegal to build apartments. And so I think if that place had been permitted, instead of being permitted for 9 5-bedroom homes, being permitted for 45 bedrooms. And leave some flexibility up. It's obviously has met the environmental and, you know, whatever our important requirements are for 45 bedrooms. But because it's just 9 houses, it's not considered, big houses aren't considered development. Only houses for low middle income people. And I think switching to kind of number of bedrooms, I think permitting by number of bedrooms, I think, you know, might be helpful. The second thing is that the ag zone is really not really accurate. We have a lot of land that's zoned for agriculture that has either been destroyed for agriculture by the settlement pattern, the piano key lots, or the soils are just plain atrocious. And it was originally, I think, zoned basically the absence of trees meant agriculture. And there are some fine agricultural soils in the Golden Triangle that are currently not developed. I mean, some of the best soils in Jericho. So I think it's really important to take a look at what is, honest to gosh, legitimate ag soil. The fourth thing is, each of these towns, including Jericho, we look at ourselves as like independent, our own planet. And when you look at just the map of Jericho, Route 17 looks like it's on the extremity. When it's actually, you know, right in between Essex and Richmond and, you know, and the highway, and there's really high density development just over the border in either direction in Richmond, you know, and in Essex. And I think to not really look at that as being an area for potential growth, and also the same for the area next to West Bolton. I think we need to look at, kind of where we are in the grand, in the grand scheme. And then the third, I just want to point out that I mean, Kurt had to simplify the chart, but the things that he said are the current zoning, or some of them require conditional use approval. So a triplex is only a permitted use in 14% of town. And you need the conditional use to get up to whatever it is, the 30% where it's possible to build. And this density question is something that was is on the list from the affordable housing committee.
Density is defined by septic capacity, by none of this stuff.
Wayne, you have your hand up, or did you want to add something new?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I just wanted to point out that I think comparing our density to Heinsberg or Richmond really isn't very accurate or scientifically based, because both those towns have wastewater treatment plants. And if you look in their zoning, when they talk about density, there's all these little asterisks, and they say, oh, and you have to hook to our pipes. You can't roll your own septic system. In our case, our resources are soils, and I think the soils have to inform what our densities are of where we want to put, developments anywhere outside these villages. The villages have the soils, but you have to base your density on what soil is available in that area you want to build in.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to say two follow-up things. So Chuck pointed out that some of the numbers are conditional uses, some are permitted uses. The numbers that were included in those tables were consistent for the table. So either they were all permitted uses or they were all conditional uses. So it was comparing apples to apples. And then Wayne's point about having to take into account septic versus not septic. So some of the zones that, like the Heinsberg zones, specifically where this zone is for housing in an area not to be served by septic. So I think I tried to work really hard to make sure that, again, it is hard, but I tried to make sure that they were as consistent as they could be.
Do you mean not to be served by septic or to
Yeah.
be served by septic?
Not to be served by septic.
Like municipal sewer.
Not to be served by municipal septic.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
So those were the districts we looked at. We didn't look at village and
Yep.
sewer districts and all that.
Just,
Correct.
Okay.
No, that was.
Is this your last slide?
Important word.
On this.
Yes, well, we've gotten through that one, so yes.
Okay, so, is everybody game for like 5 more minutes, just so that we can wrap up here? Yes, thank you very much. Okay.
Okay, so let's be real quick on these. So Home for All, got a call from the student. So we had a great interview team and we did not get selected as a pilot program. So, but I'm talking to some folks at UVM and the Leahy Institute about maybe getting something queued up for us next summer so that we can do kind of our own version and looking at infill in those areas. So stay tuned for that. And then for the wastewater task force, I just want to say one of the things that came up, I think I've mentioned this before, was a need to do some analysis at different types of development scenarios and revenue streams and tax streams and something like that for development on a purpose site. So I'm going to be writing a NPG grant application to get some funding to do a study like that. So that's all that I've got for this.
Okay, does anybody else have any updates? Nope. Okay, then, any other business? I'll just say that Sabina and I are going.
Sorry, I
out.
was muted. I actually said I have an update. I didn't realize.
Oh,
I was
go ahead.
muted. Sorry. I just wanted to give a shout out to the Bicycle and Pedestrian Connectivity Committee. They did their work with AARP recently and successfully excavated the existing sidewalk along Raceway that connects to Jerry Hill. So if you haven't had a chance to drive by and take a look at their work, there's a clearly defined path now that comes out of the Jerry Hill right of way and goes along Raceway for almost to the Route 15 intersection. So anyway, they did a nice job.
Thank you, Sabina. Actually, Sabina did a lot to help make that happen. And Sabina and I are going to the town fair tomorrow. Are you going? There's another one that you're going to. You're going to the one in Montpelier, I think. And the first session I'm going to is about capital planning. The second session was about how to get bonds approved. So interesting, good stuff to learn. Okay, then October 21st, we will digest, hopefully have a task force subgroup, a SWAT team. I love that, ahead of time before our meeting, maybe as everybody digests what we've talked about this evening. That'll be our agenda for the 21st.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Motion to adjourn. Chris Brown is
Motion to
so reliable. Adjourn. I'll second it.
There
All
we
those-
go.
All those in favor say yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,